You know, there's something remarkably dramatic about tearing things apart. And we live in a day when that's being done a great deal. And there is something about that that's dramatic. Rip it. That's what a lot of people do. We have split-level houses, and it isn't long until we have split houses. And all of a sudden, people get into some kind of a frustration or anger or a little bit of problem, and they suddenly decide they don't want to put up with it anymore, and everybody is dividing things. Dividing. Young parents say to me, I'm not exactly sure we're going to be able to make it. We've got one problem in our house, and they're suddenly in the divorce courts, and that's the drama of today. Tear it apart. God believes in dividing, but God also believes in putting back together. In the very opening of Genesis, God divided the light from the darkness, but they never got far apart. He sewed them back together again. And so no matter where you look, the light and the darkness come together, and there's a little something that they're divided and they're put back together again. He divided the heavens from the earth, and so God took, and that was heaven, and this was earth, and yet they're not really divided. For no matter where you go, and you look out into the distance, the horizon bends down to it, and He sews them back together again, and they're stitched together and healed. And then God divided the land from the sea, and the sea comes and nibbles at the sand, and the land goes out to the sea, and the two have been divided, but they're stitched together and healed. And then God brought in the wonderful business of generation, and there's a mother, and she has a babe within that womb, and that womb is a nice soft place for that babe to grow. And after a few months, God says He divides the child from the mother, and then He takes and sews the child back into the entire family, and they're stitched together and healed. And the farmer goes out and he sows the seed, and he puts it down into the ground, and then it grows and it becomes a stalk, and he goes and takes and tears it out, and then he takes some of the seed, and they say he sews it back, and it's stitched together and healed. And God has a way that even though we may talk about dividing things, His business is to put them back together again. If I needed a good text, and every good Orthodox sermon has to have a text, Psalm 23:3, He restoreth my soul. I'd like to talk this morning about how God has stitched together and healed us when everything has torn us apart. Sin tore us apart, and therefore when God says He restoreth my soul, something has happened. Sin has had an awful effect upon this world. The whole universe has felt the effects of it. When Jesus went out and stood at the grave of Lazarus, He wept with the sisters, but before He went there, it is said He groaned in His spirit. And that's more than just weeping. I think when He looked upon what had happened to His world, that they'd plowed it with graves and death had come in and all of the sorrow, He groaned because of what sin had done. And Psalm 97:10 says, you who love the Lord hate iniquity. Hate it because of what it has done. Let me remind you of what has happened when He restoreth my soul. First of all, He restored me to myself. One of the actions of sin is it has torn people apart. We have become various parts when probably originally we were a wonderful whole. Now we talk about spirit and body and soul, and sometimes the three seem to be in constant turmoil. But when He restoreth my soul, He restored me to myself. When I accepted Jesus Christ as my Savior, something happened that gave me the identity of who I was. Not only of who He was, but who I was. That I was a child of God, and that I was one for whom Jesus died. And He restored me to myself. I have seen young people in recent years, and we've got a lot of them on the West Coast, and they sometimes say, well, I'm going. Well, where are you going? Well, I'm going to Europe, and I watch some of them. Mostly they have long hair and filthy beards and overalls and bare feet, and they got backpacks. And I say, where are you going? Well, going to Europe. What for? Going to find myself. Oh, have you been there before? No? Well, then how do you know you're there? And I'm going to find myself. And people go up in the mountains, and they go to the sea, and they go in this and that, and I'm trying to find myself. And the wonderful thing about being a Christian is He restoreth me to myself. myself. I now know who I am. I know what I am. I know what powers are at my resource and disposal. I recognize that God, the Creator, has made me, and now He's put me back together again. And I have been restored to myself. I remember some years ago when our children were young, and we were living here and up in Glen Haven in the parsonage between a couple of snowbanks. But one Christmas, we had a little party, and at the end of the Christmas party that night, I kept a couple of young men up there. We were all young in those days, and one young fellow was a manufacturer, and he was well on his way in manufacturing, and he bragged about he could work every machine in his factory better than any of his employees. So I thought he would be helpful. The other one I kept was a young man who carried an engineer's license in a radio station. I thought he could help me because I had purchased for my children one of these things you have to put together. Now, it was a great surprise. I had purchased it thinking it would come assembled. Instead of that, we get a big box with a batch of parts. So when everybody else has gone home, I said, these fellas, you got to stay and help me. So here we are, three big, grown, mature men sitting on the front room floor trying to put this thing together. Up on our hunkers, studying the diagrams, putting it in here and there. The worst was our wives sat on the couch and offered suggestions. Could you use a bobby pin? Don't you think? And along about 2 o'clock in the morning, it took coffee and donuts to get things soothed down. And at last, about 4 a.m., we got that thing in a workable condition. It finally would work. There were 3 pieces left over, but it still worked. And as we carted out the box, on the outside of the box it said, can be assembled in 30 minutes by any 10-year-old boy. I remember the classic remark. One fellow said, I would give anything to meet the guy who made that thing. That's exactly right. And you know, when you come into life and you discover you've got a life, and you have a mind, and you have talents, and you have faculties, and you have a future, and you have hopes, and you have dreams, but you stumble and you fall and you have sin, and what you want to do is meet the one who made it. And that's the glory of Jesus Christ, that in meeting Him you meet the one who made the thing. And He restoreth my soul. He restores me to myself. He restores me to Himself. You see, sin had separated me from God. Isaiah 53:6 says that all we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way. Everyone to his own way. Everyone thinks that somehow in sin you find more fellowship, but that isn't really so. Everyone is lonely in sin. Sin is a lonely business. Everyone to his own way. Individualism, which is now plaguing our culture, is the result of what sin does. I want my way, I want my rights, and pretty soon, instead of having any kind of communication, we get to be lonely people, each going his own way, until the final result is they wind up in hell, a place of lost identities, everyone going his own way. But He restoreth my soul. He restoreth me to Himself. Sin had torn me out of the very heart of God, and while I was away from Him, He looked upon me and loved me, and determined by His grace He would put me back into the family. That was quite a day. God said, I'm going to restore him. We have for a number of years now had a great crusade, and I am not in any way criticizing it, but the slogan has been, I found it. The only thing is that doctrinally that's backwards. He found me. I did not find him. He found me. And we paint nice, clean little pictures of the shepherd going out after the one lost sheep and leaning down over that cliff and lifting up the little lamb. But that isn't really what happened. It was instead that out of the heights of glory through the black crags of the night, he stooped, coming down past meteors himself brighter than them all, and stooped clear down into a world. He wore the rugged garment of human flesh and stooped down to the depth of sin and degradation to lift us up at the risk of himself. No one knows how much God put on the line when Jesus Christ was crucified. Psalm 22, which is the foreshadow or the foreecho of Calvary, simply seems to describe but a small amount of it. My God, he cries, why hast thou forsaken me? He was in hell when he said that. The Son of God was out of place. He who was one of the eternal Trinity had been broken into the society of the everlasting three, and he had died upon a cross, and God was out of place at Calvary. He looks upon those around him and says, our fathers trusted in thee. As a son of David he is out of place. Even as a Jew he is out of place. For our fathers trusted in thee. Thou did not forsake them, but thou hast forsaken me. As a son of man he is out of place. He said, I am no longer a man. I am vermiform. I'm like a worm, as though that which came from the virgin's womb were like a worm rather than a human. And as the Son of Man, he was out of place. He cries out, they have taken my garments and cast lots for them. Even socially he is out of place. The dogs of Bashan gather about him. Economically he's out of place. They take his garments. Physically he's out of place. For he says that all of my bones stand out. And at last cries, my heart is melted in the midst of my bowels, as though that heart which cradled eternal love could be melted down like a shapeless candle in a pile of bile. He is out of place. What for? That he might take and reach me, the lost one, and bringing me up, restore me to God. Christ hath once suffered for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God. And he restores me to himself, so that now I am no longer in Adam, but in Christ. I am not of this world. I am in his kingdom. I am in him. He restores me to himself. But he does something else. He restores me to you. To you. Are you the church of God? Are you the people of God? I'm sorry, you're stuck with me. And I'm stuck with you. Because now we have become eternally part of each other. We have been joined to Christ. And thus, we have been joined to each other. It was last spring, a western state. And it was a normal day for you. You got up and went to work that morning, and in a hospital operating theater, they suddenly wheeled in the main characters in the drama. These were two little bodies that for 19 months had been in the world and had been united, just joined together in such a monstrous position that there was no way their lives could be normal. And the surgeons had x-rayed and examined and at last said, we think we can perform it. But an operation like this had never been performed successfully in the history of medicine or surgery. It's an ordinary day with you, but it's no ordinary day for them. Lisa and Elisa Hansen are wheeled into that surgical theater, and all of the doctors have gathered around, and everything has been orchestrated. It is almost like a giant ballet. You can almost hear the music going on of the machinery whirring this way and that, and the finger of the computer writing its little messages, and all the doctors standing there ready to begin. It's 9:30 in the morning, and you have gone to work, and up in the hospital operating theater, the machines are sucking and whirring around, and the computer's running, and the nurses are moving around, and suddenly those two little bodies are there, stretched out on a single table, and the doctors gather around them. They're standing there. They have begun the work. Every command is immediately offered. Scalpel, please. Please, suture, please. On and on it goes. It's 12 o'clock. You go to work, but the doctors are still there. You've gone out to lunch, but they're still operating. 3:30 in the afternoon, you've had your coffee break, and the operating table, everything is going on as it was scheduled. Doctors are stepping back and fresh doctors stepping in. Nurses are coming and going. There's hardly the sound of a human voice. goes the machinery. Whirr goes the little wheels, and the blood is running down through the tubes, and everything is moving around and around, except that everything is in perfect order now. It's 5:30. You've gone home for the day. The doctors are still standing by the table. One steps back. His garments are dripping with perspiration. Another one steps into line. One takes them this, and all of a sudden everything seems to tighten up. Just what will we find? They have not thought that the brains were connected, that they have separate brains. Maybe there will be only a slight little blood vessel between them. It gets on later in the night. You go out and sit on the back porch for a little while and come in, you listen to the news. It's 11:30 and people go to bed, and Johnny Carson tells a few risque jokes and everybody turns over, and the doctors are still standing there by that table. It has come to be 1 o'clock in the morning, and Carson goes off and the late movie begins. Bang, 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 bang goes the West. Bang, 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 and the machine is going whirr, going round and round, and all of a sudden one doctor looks over at the other, and you can see the eyes across the mask. That's it. A hand incomparably skilled takes an instrument incredibly sharp, and there is a moment of destiny, and suture, please. It's joined together, and it's 2 o'clock in the morning, and the planes come in at Los Angeles, and one pilot says, "Do you think there's any other nuts up at this hour of the morning?" And up in the operating room, they are saying, close it up, and suddenly the nurses say, "We've done it! Done it!" And the doctors grasp each other, and two little bodies that have never been separated in 19 months are wheeled out on separate carts. And Dr. Stephen Minton goes out to greet the parents and says, "I love them. I want them to be normal." You know, there's a greater drama than the drama of separation. That's the drama of union. And God one day looked upon us, and he broke down all the walls of partition, and then he stitches together. And in Ephesians chapter 2, you can read some of the story. "My brethren, in times past," says Paul, "you were Gentiles. You were without Christ. But now, in Christ Jesus, you who once were far off are made near by the blood of Christ. For he is our peace, who hath made both one, and hath broken down the middle wall of partition between us, having abolished in his flesh the enmity, even the law of commandments contained in ordinances, to make in himself of two one new man. And you and I have been joined not only to Jesus, we have been joined to each other, stitched together, and healed. You know, that's the ministry that makes the church go on, is the healing. Stitched together and healed. We have never had such an hour, perhaps in the Christian community, when there's been such a need for healing. Because there are so many things of our culture we've had to counter with that we didn't think we had to face years ago. We've got to face them now. Let it heal. Jesus one day freed a demoniac of his demons, and the demoniac said, "I want to go with you." And Jesus said, "No, go home." "Oh, well," he said, "if I go home, you see, we've had some problems back home because of my..." He said, "Go home. Let it heal. Let it heal. Let it heal." And there was a leper who came to Jesus, and Jesus said, "I'm not only going to heal you, I want you to go down to the priest and show yourself to him, because you've been broken apart from society now, and let the priest take and put you back in society, and let it heal. Let it heal. Let it heal." Jesus one day stood in the home of Simon the Pharisee, and there was a woman who came in from the street, and she washed his feet with her tears and bathed them with the beautiful ointment. And Simon said, "Does he know what kind of a woman that is?" And Jesus gave him a little parable about one forgiven much and one forgiven little. And he said, "Simon, that woman, she's been forgiven much. Now let it heal. Let it heal. Let it heal." Paul and Barnabas one day come to a disagreement, a great dissension. Are they going to take John Mark along? And Paul says, "We can't take him. That young man failed." And Barnabas said, "He's my nephew." And Paul said, "Relatives don't count here." And Barnabas said, "I want to take him." And Paul said, "No, we can't do that." And they split apart. And But years later, Paul writes to Timothy, bring Mark, he's profitable for me. Let it heal. Let it heal. Let it heal. Oh, there are so many things in our world today that need healing. Our older daughter Karen has a little boy she adopted some years ago, as most of you know. We were down there one year and we showed her the picture of some other youngsters in our church. And we said, these are adopted like you. And Jason said, I'm not adopted anymore. We said, oh no? He said, no, I got over that 2 weeks ago. That's right. Just let it heal. Let it heal. Let it heal. Let it heal. You've been looking at the history of this church, and there are a lot of things that today break us apart and break people apart. Down through the years, it's not been perfect, as has been said time and again, but let it heal. Let it heal. Let it heal. Let it heal. Paul wrote to Eutychus and Syntyche, let it heal. Let it heal. And you know, that's the power of the blood, is healing blood. Good blood is healing blood. Not the nails, not the thorns brought his heartache that day, but the sin of the world which he carried away. There is healing and balm for each heartache and loss in the heartbreak of Jesus, in the blood of the cross. He restoreth my soul. Lord, take these simple words, touch them for thy glory.